We built machines that can use language, but not understand it. And yet, those machines now decide what language means. Every post, every search, every sentence feeds an invisible grammar, a system that rewards repetition over sense. Meaning once arose between speakers. Now, what circulates between signals only resembles meaning. Wittgenstein wrote, "The meaning of a word is its use in the language." But what happens when the criteria of use themselves become automated? That is the question. Not whether AI can talk, but whether we still can. If you're interested in how philosophy helps us understand the digital world, you're in the right place. Consider subscribing, and let's think further together. Before we can ask what meaning means today, we have to see that the very conditions of meaning have changed. For centuries, philosophy treated meaning as correspondence, the alignment between word and world. From Aristotle's De Interpretation to Frege's Sense and Reference, a sentence meant if its logical form could trace reality. But that architecture has collapsed. In the digital order, reference dissolves into operation. A word no longer points, it performs. Its value lies not in truth, but in effect. This fracture didn't begin with technology. It began when Nietzsche shattered the metaphysical faith in language itself. What then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors. Meaning, for Nietzsche was never a mirror. It was a strategy of survival, a rhetorical device, disguised as description. Once language became a will to power, rather than a window to reality, its automation was only a matter of time. Wittgenstein inherited this broken mirror and turned it into an investigation of clarity itself. In the Tractatus, he still believed that the proposition is a picture of reality. But in his later philosophical investigations, he explodes that picture. The meaning of a word is its use in the language. With this, philosophy of meaning shifts from ontology to practice, from what language represents to how it functions within a form of life. The problem today is that this form of life has been outsourced. The form of life that grounds our use is no longer human. Platforms define what counts as USE, what circulates, what disappears. And if meaning depends on use, then meaning now depends on systems that cannot understand. Foucault would call this a new regime of discourse. Statements gain meaning not through argument, but through algorithmic recognition. Language still works, but too well. Every utterance finds a function, yet function replaces understanding. Meaning, once a philosophical question, risks becoming a merely technical parameter. And that's why we return to Wittgenstein, because he reminds us that to understand a word is to live with it, not just to process it, something machines cannot do, and we are beginning to forget. Ludwig Wittgenstein was not a man of theory. He was a man of tension. Born into one of the wealthiest families in Vienna, he gave away his fortune, lived like an ascetic, and taught philosophy as if it were a moral ordeal. Students at Cambridge recalled how he would pace the room in silence, then whisper a single question that dismantled everything said before. For him, philosophy was not speculation, it was therapy. "The real discovery," he wrote, "is the one that makes me capable of stopping doing philosophy when I want to." That sentence defines him better than any biography. He sought not new doctrines, but freedom from illusion, the illusions that language casts on thought itself. In his early masterpiece, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, 1921, Wittgenstein believed that the world possessed a logical structure, and that purified language could mirror it. The world is the totality of facts, not of things. Each proposition, he claimed, was a picture of reality, meaning equaled correspondence. But that crystalline structure collapsed under its own weight. Wittgenstein realized that language does not reflect the world. It creates worlds through use. When he returned to Cambridge in the 1930s, he wrote The Philosophical Investigations, a book that dismantled his own previous vision. Don't think, but look. Meaning is not hidden behind words. It is enacted in what we do with them. He called these activities language games, forms of life where words gain sense through shared rules, gestures, and expectations. To promise, to order, to name, to joke. Each is a different game, with its own grammar of meaning. If words only mean within a game, then meaning depends on the players. But what happens when the players are no longer human? When a person says, "I agree," the words carry trust, context, commitment. When a platform displays, "You agree to our terms of service," the same words perform functionally rather than intentionally. The sentence acts, but it no longer means in Wittgenstein's sense. The form of life has vanished. The rule following continues without understanding. That is the world Wittgenstein foresaw, where meaning drifts away from consciousness and survives only as syntax. Philosophy, he warned, must show the fly the way out of the fly bottle. Free thought from the traps of its own language. Today, language hasn't gone on holiday. It works overtime. And that, precisely, is our new confusion. If language doesn't mirror the world but makes it through use, the obvious next question is, can meaning ever be final? Derrida's answer is radical. Meaning is never finished. It always slips and differs. If you want the full argument that destroys the idea of a final truth, watch my Derrida video next. To study Wittgenstein now is to study the frontier between language as life and language as system, between speaking and processing. Because once meaning becomes automated use, we must ask again. Wittgenstein would remind us, a game without shared criteria is not a game, but a sequence of moves without sense. If machines can play the game of language, can they ever mean what they say? Or are they only repeating the gestures of thought without the life that gives them sense? If you find this journey into Wittgenstein's ideas valuable, consider subscribing. It helps this conversation continue. Wittgenstein's decisive move in philosophical investigations was not to explain meaning, but to show where explanation ends. The meaning of a word is its use in the language. Section 43. That sentence sounds simple, but it quietly overturns 2,000 years of philosophy. Meaning, he realized, does not live behind words. It lives in their use. To understand a word is not to grasp an essence. It is to participate in a practice. Philosophy before Wittgenstein imagined language as a code, where each word carried a fixed reference, and understanding meant decoding that reference correctly. But Wittgenstein saw that our words gain sense not from correspondence to objects, but from the ways we use them within shared activities. This is what he called language games. A game, for him, was not a metaphor, not play, not randomness. It meant a rule-governed practice. To speak is to act according to rules that are neither natural nor private, but sustained by a community, by what he called a form of life. To imagine a language is to imagine a form of life. Section 19. Following a rule is a practice. Section 202. So when I say thank you, I'm not describing gratitude, I'm performing it. When I say I promise, I'm not reporting a state, I'm creating one. The words mean because we share the practice that makes them mean. Without that background of shared life, correction, expectation, response, there is no rule to follow and no meaning to sustain it. Now fast forward to our digital age. We still play games with language, but we've forgotten that they are games. The like, the share, the retweet. These are moves in new grammars of interaction. Each has its own rule of visibility, its own reward function. But here's the difference. In classical language games, the rules were social. In algorithmic games, the rules are computational. Platforms don't forbid speech, they parameterize it. Their forms of life are not lived but designed. A machine doesn't join our form of life, it produces one for us. We inhabit grammars we didn't write, grammars that now write us. Wittgenstein warned that philosophy must show the fly the way out of the fly bottle. Section 309. Today, the bottle is not grammar. It is the interface. We are trapped not by the limits of language, but by the architectures that decide which uses of language still count as meaning. So when we ask, how do language games create meaning? The answer is, only where there is life behind the use, where words are lived, not only executed. Because when the game continues without players, we are left with perfect rule following and no understanding, syntax without sense. Wittgenstein called the idea of a private language one of philosophy's most persistent illusions. A language understandable by only one person. A language that names my inner sensations beyond all shared criteria. A private language is one in which the words are to refer to what can only be known to the person speaking, to his immediate private sensations. Section 243. At first glance, that sounds plausible. Surely I can invent words for my own pain, joy, or fear. But Wittgenstein asks, how would I know that I'm using them correctly? If no one can check my use, if there is no rule beyond what seems right to me, then there is no difference between using a word rightly and merely thinking I do. And where there is no possibility of being wrong, there is no rule at all. That's the key insight. Language, for Wittgenstein, is not a mirror of private experience. It's a shared practice, a space of correction and recognition. Meaning depends on criteria that are public, not mental. To mean something is to make a move that others can follow, accept, or reject. Remove that horizon of life, and meaning collapses into what he called logical solipsism, a position that cancels the very grammar of sense. Now, let's transpose this into our own time. When an AI model learns language, it doesn't enter a form of life. It processes a form of data. It predicts the next word, not from experience, but from statistical correlation. Its rules are encoded in parameters, not sustained in practice. It never belongs to the community that gives those rules meaning. A machine can follow rules, but, as Wittgenstein reminds us, to obey a rule is a practice. Section 202. Following a rule as a practice requires correction, misunderstanding, and agreement in judgment. An algorithm has none of these. Its rule following is purely formal, always consistent, never accountable. It cannot be wrong in the Wittgensteinian sense, because it never means to be right. So its language is not private, it's non-public. It resembles ours, but lacks the life that sustains meaning. It produces sentences that sound intelligible, yet cannot answer the simplest question. In what world do these words live? When a child learns red, she points, compares, and negotiates. She learns to see as others see. When a model learns red, it doesn't see, it sorts. It recognizes nothing, it only calculates. Resemblance without participation is simulation, and that's why the private language argument still matters. It reminds us that meaning is not stored, it's lived. Machines reproduce syntax without inhabiting sense. They play the gestures of thought without the life that gives them meaning. So when we ask whether AI could ever have its own private language, Wittgenstein's answer remains decisive. Without a shared form of life, there is no meaning, only structured noise that happens to sound grammatical. Do you agree with Wittgenstein? Tell me in the comments. I read and respond to every thought. And if this kind of deep dive into the logic of meaning resonates with you, hit subscribe. It helps this philosophical conversation continue. So if meaning depends on shared rules, and those rules define what can count as understanding, we must ask a harder question. Who decides the rules? Who sets the boundaries of what can be said, repeated, or believed? For Wittgenstein, rule following was a practice. For Foucault, every practice hides a politics, a system of power that decides which uses of language will count as true. And that's where our next question begins. If meaning depends on shared rules, then whoever writes the rules writes the world. For Wittgenstein, rule following was a practice. To speak meaningfully was to participate in a form of life, a web of customs, corrections, and mutual recognition. But no form of life is innocent. Each already carries an implicit politics of sense. Michel Foucault called this the regime of truth. Each society has its regime of truth, the types of discourse it accepts and makes function as true. Power Knowledge, 1977. Every epoch decides not only what can be said, who is allowed to say it, and under what conditions that speech counts as knowledge. In the 20th century, those regimes were visible. Universities, courts, newspapers, schools, institutions that produce truth through recognizable rituals of verification. In the 21st, the stage has shifted. Platforms, not parliaments, now set the grammar of the public sphere. Their rules are written not in legal codes, but in algorithms, ranking systems, moderation filters, engagement metrics. They decide what appears, what vanishes, and what becomes thinkable. The algorithm doesn't command, it conditions. It governs not by censorship, but by calibration. It filters, recommends, promotes, quietly determining which uses of language remain visible and which disappear beneath the threshold of perception. A platform's community guidelines sound ethical, but they are a form of linguistic infrastructure. They define what words are monetizable, what tones are brand safe, which emotions sustain engagement. They legislate affect. A tweet that says, "I'm outraged," travels faster than one that says, "I'm uncertain." The system rewards heat over depth, reaction over reflection. Over time, grammar itself bends toward performance. We no longer speak freely inside the algorithm. We speak along its gradients. Imagine wanting to express a thought still forming, vague, fragile, the kind of thought that needs language to become clear. But before your sentence exists, the system already predicts its category. Negativity, harm, controversy, misinformation. Your thought is evaluated not by its truth, but by its predicted effects. So you adjust a word here, soften a claim there, until it stops triggering filters and starts surviving visibility. The expression changes before the idea does. And in that moment, the world no longer corrects our language. Language corrects our world. Wittgenstein showed that rule following sustains meaning. Foucault revealed that rule-making sustains power. Today, the two collapse into one mechanism, the automated management of discourse. We are no longer just players in language games. We are the data that keeps the game running. And if meaning depends on use, and use is now algorithmically defined, then who, in the end, is speaking through us? If that question makes you pause, good. That pause is philosophy doing its work. And if you want to keep thinking beyond the algorithm, subscribe. And let's continue this investigation together. If the rules of language now live inside algorithms, then the next question writes itself. Algorithms follow rules flawlessly, but do they understand them? They perform what Wittgenstein called rule following, yet without belonging to any form of life. They never hesitate, never misunderstand, never doubt, and yet, precisely for that reason, they may never mean. Wittgenstein warned us, to obey a rule is a practice. Section 202. It requires a community, correction, intention. But algorithms have none of these. They reproduce use without living it. They execute grammar without inhabiting sense. So if meaning depends on life, what happens when life is removed from language? That's the next question. And it's not about machines learning us. It's about us forgetting how to mean. If the rules of language now live inside algorithms, the next question is unavoidable. Do algorithms understand meaning, or do they only predict it? Wittgenstein once wrote, "If a lion could talk, we could not understand him." Section 200-23. Not because the lion lacks language, but because we do not share its form of life. Understanding, for Wittgenstein, is not decoding symbols. It is inhabiting a world where those symbols make sense. Algorithms talk endlessly, but in no world we inhabit. They compose grammatically, yet remain ontologically silent. They don't interpret, they interpolate. Their sentences arise not from experience, but from probability. What we call intelligence is, in truth, correlation perfected. When a human says, "I'm afraid," the words point to a body, a memory, a horizon of meaning. When an algorithm says the same, it risks nothing, and therefore means nothing. It performs understanding without ever possessing it. Because meaning, as Wittgenstein reminds us, depends on intention within a form of life. To follow a rule mechanically is not to follow it at all. To obey a rule is a practice. Section 200-2. It requires context, correction, and the possibility of error. An algorithm has none of these. Its rule following is purely formal, always accurate, never right or wrong. And so, accuracy replaces understanding. Here the paradox deepens. Though machines cannot understand, they now define what counts as intelligible. They filter and rank our words until we begin to think in their patterns. We learn to write for the system, shorter, simpler, more predictable. A human imitation of the machine that imitates us. A poet hesitates before a word, feeling for the rhythm of sense. A model selects instantly, optimizing for probability. Both produce text, but only one experiences the delay where meaning appears. That delay, the pause between word and world, is what Derrida called difference, the gap through which sense is born. Algorithms abolish that gap. They render meaning immediate, and in doing so, destroy its depth. The problem is not that AI fails to mean, but that it teaches us to forget how to mean. Because to understand, in Wittgenstein's sense, requires dwelling in time, allowing the divergence between saying and meaning to exist. Prediction erases that space. It gives us fluency without reflection, communication without community, and language without life. So we must ask, if machines now speak in our place, do they merely predict our words? Or have they begun to predict us? If this question makes you stop for a moment, keep it. That pause is meaning. And if you want to keep thinking where algorithms end, subscribe. We're just getting started. If algorithms abolish the pause where meaning appears, what takes its place? When understanding becomes prediction and reflection gives way to performance, language no longer asks, "Is this true?" but "Does this work?" That shift from truth to performance, from sense to success, is not just technical, it's civilizational. Jean-François Lyotard saw it coming half a century ago. Performativity replaces legitimacy. The Postmodern Condition, 1979. And that's the world we now inhabit, where words mean if they circulate, where language performs because it must be seen. So the next question is simple and terrifying. What happens when meaning itself begins to depend on metrics? When language is reduced to data, the measure of meaning becomes performance. Once, words drew their authority from truth, coherence, or beauty. Now, they gain authority from metrics. A sentence means if it circulates. It matters if it trends. Jean-François Lyotard foresaw this half a century ago. Performativity replaces legitimacy. The Postmodern Condition, 1979. In the digital order, this is not a metaphor, it's an architecture. The metric is the meaning. To say something well now means to say it in a form the system can amplify. The platform becomes the new grammar, rewarding whatever sustains attention. But attention, as Byung-Chul Han warns, is no longer contemplation, it is consumption. When every utterance is measured, silence becomes an error, and reflection a form of inefficiency. The algorithm doesn't ask whether a sentence is true, it asks whether it performs. It tracks retention, not resonance, reach, not reflection. It doesn't interpret, it counts. A philosopher may write, "Freedom requires self-limitation." A post saying, "Never let anyone control you," will always win the metric war. Not because it's wiser, but because it's easier to process, simpler to share, faster to feel. The deeper sentence loses by design. This is what Wittgenstein might have called the mechanization of use. Words still function, but the form of life that once gave them weight has been flattened into a form of output. Meaning no longer measures understanding, it measures engagement. As Foucault would note, power now circulates not through what can be said, but through what can be seen. And as Baudrillard warned, the real is produced from miniaturized units, models, codes, metrics. Meaning doesn't die, it metastasizes. Truth survives only as a useful illusion. Virality replaces verification. Attention becomes the currency of belief. When meaning depends on metrics, we stop asking what it means and start asking how it performs. Philosophy itself risks extinction, not because it lacks relevance, but because it lacks speed. Yet resistance may begin here, in the refusal to treat understanding as output, to read slowly, to think beyond the count, to value what cannot be measured. These become acts of philosophical defiance, because, as Wittgenstein knew, the worth of a sentence lies not in how far it travels, but in whether it changes the life that speaks it. When language becomes machinery, philosophy becomes maintenance. Not of systems, but of sense itself. Wittgenstein called philosophy a therapy for language. Philosophy is not a body of doctrine, but an activity. Its task, he said, is to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle, to free thought from the traps it builds in speech. Today, the bottle is algorithmic. Our concepts no longer confine us. Our platforms do. We don't suffer from a lack of expression, but from its automation. The cure, then, is not silence, but slowing down. Foucault wrote that philosophy begins where what we take for granted starts to tremble. Its task is not to produce truth, but to make the field of truth visible. The very visibility metrics erase. Byung-Chul Han calls the antidote contemplation. Only in the capacity to dwell does freedom begin. To dwell in language means to listen before we answer, to delay the reaction until meaning can breathe again. Derrida would name that delay difference, the space where interpretation survives automation. Every pause, every ambiguity we refuse to delete is a small act of freedom inside the machine. This is why philosophy still matters. It teaches us how to keep words alive when everything around them tries to perform instead of think. It reminds us that the measure of meaning is not efficiency, but care. To philosophize today is to reclaim rulemaking from code, to decide again what counts as understanding, what deserves to be said, and what must remain unsaid. Philosophy cannot compete with algorithms in speed, but it can outlast them in depth. Its medium is not data, but attention. And attention, deliberate, patient, unmeasured, is the last form of resistance that cannot be quantified. So, when language becomes pure performance, philosophy becomes the refusal to perform, the art of listening in a world that only measures noise. If philosophy still matters to you, join this community. Hit subscribe. Let's keep thinking where algorithms end. If the meaning of a word is its use, and use is now automated, then meaning itself has become alienated from human intention. The sentence speaks, but the speaker dissolves. We post, comment, generate, but the words that leave us no longer belong to us. They are routed, ranked, reformatted, processed by systems that know everything about language, except what it means to speak. Foucault wrote that modernity begins when man becomes both the subject and the object of knowledge. Now that circle has closed. We are both the users and the USAD, the inputs of a linguistic machine that learns us faster than we can learn ourselves. Derrida foresaw this too: writing without an author, signs that continue after us, language indifferent to meaning. The internet fulfilled that prophecy, a self-writing archive that no longer needs consciousness to persist. And yet Wittgenstein might have added one more question. If meaning lives in our forms of life, then the issue is not only who speaks, but whether life itself still speaks through us. Because when language ceases to be lived, it becomes merely executed. When execution replaces expression, thought becomes outsourced. But philosophy, quietly, stubbornly, keeps another possibility open. It reminds us that even inside automation, speech can still be reclaimed, not by shouting louder, but by meaning deliberately. Every act of attention, every word we refuse to let the system finish for us, is an act of authorship in a post-author world. Perhaps the question, who is speaking through us, can only be answered in the plural. The machine speaks, the culture speaks. But sometimes, if we listen carefully, something human interrupts. A hesitation, a choice of word, a silence. And in that silence, language becomes ours again. And if this video gave you something to think about, subscribe and come back for the next chapter.